welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. Service on Celluloid is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini-episode where I will answer comments and questions from the previous episode. My name is Seth Patton, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1970 film Patton. The epic biopic focuses on the World War II years of famous American General George S. Patton, Jr. The film picks up as General Patton takes command of U.S. Second Corps in North Africa, following its humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass. The film follows Patton's military successes and some of his political failures throughout the war. Patton stars George C. Scott as the venerable George S. Patton, Jr., Carl Malden as General Omar Bradley, Michael Bates, and Carl Michael Vogler. It was directed by Franklin Schaffner and written by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North. The film was both a financial and critical success, being nominated for 10 Academy Awards, winning 7, including Best Actor and Best Picture.
I wouldn't want him as a relative, but under the circumstances, and his performance was outstanding. I would, today, if there was a need for a Patton, I would go with him. What happened was, during the war, Patton would make Bonham and Bailey look sick if he was in the circus business. He just had that makeup. And people in the know during the war didn't like his persona, so to speak, but his performance was what was liked.
That was the voice of Major Abraham J. Baum, reminiscing about General George S. Patton, Jr. Major Baum had several one-on-one run-ins with General Patton and thus knew him rather well for a lower-ranking officer in Patton's Third Army. We'll hear more from Major Baum later on. As we talked about in the main episode, General George S. Patton was a polarizing figure. He was someone who was both loved and hated. Some of his men, rather the majority of his men, loved him. They loved him for both his devil-may-care attitude and his aggressiveness. The guys that I knew who served in Third Army always referred to it as Patton's Third Army. They made no bones about who their commanding general was, and they were incessantly proud of the fact that they were led by a living legend. And make no mistake about it, Patton was a legend in his own time. I didn't say a legend in his own mind, although that was also the case. He was a legend amongst his soldiers as well as his peers, and his enemies too, for that matter. The Germans respected General Patton probably more so than any other American general. General Patton first made headlines in 1941 during the Louisiana maneuvers. Patton commanded the 2nd Armored Division as part of the Blue Army during the maneuvers, and the Blue Army emerged victorious in the maneuvers, largely due to Patton's aggressive tactics. While here in Louisiana, he endeared himself to the local population who were essentially surrounded by the maneuvers, and this isn't in New Orleans or anything like that. The Louisiana maneuvers were out west in Sabine Parish, and it took over a huge portion of the state in 1941. He was always polite, very courteous, and he was a gentleman of civilians. His aristocratic upbringing charmed most who met him. And also, for those who had been wondering about his reference to Louisiana and New Orleans in the famous opening scene in the movie Patton, where he's given his speech to the Third Army, which in the movie they never say, but like we said in the main episode, he's speaking to Third Army on June 5th, 44. It's because of his involvement in Louisiana maneuvers. He spent a great deal of time here in Louisiana in 1941, and he makes reference to shoveling defecation, if you will, in Louisiana, and he's referring to those times in 1941 during the maneuvers. Once overseas and in the field, Patton wasted no time in putting his stamp on the headlines that blared the war news daily. North Africa and especially Sicily were both military and personal triumphs for the general from California. But it wasn't until General Patton took command of the Third Army just before D-Day that he really hit his stride. And that's one thing we talked about in the main episode. We talked about what the film got right. And we didn't really talk about too much of what the film got wrong, but that's one thing that it did get wrong. In the movie, it shows General Patton essentially begging Omar Bradley, and we assume at one point General Eisenhower, for a command of the Third Army, well, for a command of any type. And that's not the case. And then the movie shows Patton getting command of Third Army while it's already in France, and that's also not the case. George Patton knew full well that he was being given command of the Third Army long before the Normandy invasion ever occurred. So there was no begging for a command or anything like that. like they show in the movie. That was, a bit of Hollywood drama. But once in command of the Third Army, Patton became arguably the most impactful, most aggressive, most successful Army commander in the European theater. He pushed his men relentlessly. He felt that heavy casualties sustained early would be less than if an operation took longer. And that was one thing that he and Montgomery were always at odds on. And you kind of see this in the movie quite a bit. I can't remember which one of our panelists described the portrayal of Montgomery as almost cartoonish, but it's very true. But he and General Patton did have a rivalry, and they did not like one another. They were not friends. And Monty's view of things was to take things slowly and be cautious, and in so doing, it might take him 6 weeks to take an objective, where as Patton would just run into it headlong. He'd shove his head right through the brick wall to try and break through, and try and get it done in 2 weeks as opposed to 6. Well, he would take more casualties, but in the long run, he felt that it was better to take more casualties initially than be stuck in a meat grinder for weeks on end, as Montgomery would generally like to do. As I said, he felt that heavy casualties sustained earlier would be less than an operation took longer. Blasting his way across France at such speeds that the Third Army did, Patton actually outran his own logistics, meaning his tanks and armored infantry units moved so rapidly that their own fuel, ammunition, and food supplies could not keep up with them. And that's something, again, you see in the movie. There's one part, it's kind of a little bit better than 3/4 of the way through, I guess, where his lead tank units run out of fuel in the middle of the night, and they run right into another German tank unit, and they have this really nasty firefight. Well, that happened. And that happened a lot. It wasn't just that one time like it shows in the movie. It happened quite often. It was not uncommon for Patton's lead units to run out of fuel mid-march because they had overextended their supply lines by simply outrunning them. He was, foot to the floorboards 24 hours a day. He wanted to get the war done as soon as he possibly could, knowing that his job was ultimately to win the war. Halted only by his lack of fuel, Patton's Third Army sat poised on the German border in December 1944. In what was his, in my opinion anyway, his greatest military feat, he took the lead elements of his army, namely the 4th Armored Division, of which Abe Baum was a part, broke off contact with the Germans in the middle of an advance, whirled around, advanced north nonstop to relieve the encircled town of Bastogne and the 101st Airborne Division. And for all you Band of Brothers quoters out there, I didn't say save the 101st, I said relieve, and there is a difference. One of the units under Patton's command was the 14th Armored Division. New to the theater as of October 1944, the 14th was fresh as it rolled into Germany as a spearhead unit in mid-December. Once there, the 14th encountered fierce resistance. One of those tankers from the 14th was a man named Fred Hirsekorn. Fred served as a Sherman tank commander in the 14th and vividly recalls an encounter with the seemingly ever-present Patton as his unit rolled deeper into Germany. Let's listen to what Fred has to say.
One other experience with George Patton unknowingly. As we advanced about that time, the advance was fairly rapid. The Germans had left bazookas, which they're Panzerfaust, laying at the side of the road, and we found that kids picked these things up and fired them at our tanks. And so we were in a quandary. Do we shoot at kids at the side of the road because they look threatening? Do we kill children because the Germans were down to kids too, and these were, in many cases, civilian kids? Do we kill them? What do we do? So the decision was that we would spend the night welding angle iron brackets on the sides and front of each tank, fill sandbags, put them in the brackets so that the thermite in these bazookas would burn through the sand and maybe into the steel a little bit, but would not enter the tank and disable it and maim or kill guys inside. The next morning, we were advancing towards the front line again, and mine was a lead tank when I see a Jeep coming up with 3 guys inside, and fella steps out and he's got a couple of revolvers on each hip with white handles on them, and he stops my tank and he says, "You yellow-bellied bastards, where's your company commander?" And then I began to see the stars on the bumper of his Jeep, and the major get out, another guy in the tank. I don't know what he was doing. And within a minute or two, the radio came from Captain in the yards, like, "Andrew, all right, everybody, dismount. Take off the sandbags and get rid of the angle iron on the side of the tanks." And we thought, oh my God. Orders of General Patton. So I knew who it was I saw. And we did. We took off the sandbags and scraped the tanks against each other to knock off the angle iron, and advanced. And after that, if we saw kids doing that, we had little heartbreaking choice but to defend ourselves.
As the American Army rolled deeper into Germany, instances like the one that Fred just talked about happened more and more, unfortunately. Years of brainwashing caused countless child deaths, as the brainwashed children of the Third Reich believed that a world without National Socialism was a world not worth living in. For all his successes, Patton had his share of mistakes, too. Aside from his political faux pas, of which there were many, one of his greatest, or worst, if you will, military foul-ups is one that most people have never heard of, and that's a little incident called the Hammelburg Raid. In March 1945, Third Army was deep inside Germany. The war was coming to an end, and everyone knew it. Patton's son-in-law, a gentleman by the name of John Waters, had been taken prisoner by the Germans in North Africa in 1943. And Patton was fully aware that his son-in-law was languishing in the officer-only prisoner of war camp in Hammelburg, only a scant 40 miles away from the American front lines. Advised by nearly every one of his subordinates that the mission would fail and was too risky, Patton stubbornly ordered the mission to proceed. And there's a myriad of myths or conspiracies as to why he did that, and we'll get to that on another podcast. But an armored task force under the command of Major Abraham J. Baum set off through a furious assault in defense of the town of Aschaffenburg on the night of March 26, 1945. 3 days later, having reached the POW camp, been surrounded by superior German forces, and having been subsequently destroyed, Task Force Baum, as it was known, largely became POWs themselves. Abe Baum, who was the commander of this task force from the 4th Armored Division, was himself wounded and captured. Let's hear what Abe has to say about General Patton greeting him 2 weeks later as Abe lay in his German hospital bed.
And I'm lying in bed, and in walks the colonel, and he yells, "Attention." Attention? I'm in a hospital bed. What nonsense is that? I could barely move. In walks Patton. Sits down on the edge of my bed. And we start to talk. Now, in my mind, do I rock the boat and make an issue of it? Or do I let it go by? Because we need him. Patton was needed to finish the war. He was needed. No other general, Army general, was even shining his shoes when it came to tactics, when it came to will to fight, courage and so forth. So I started to talk to him, and I said, "By the way, what happened to my unit?" He said, "They went north, east and up, and didn't meet too much resistance." So I said, "Yeah, the Germans thought the Third Army was coming. They probably moved the troops." He said, yeah. Gave him an out, in my eyes, that this task force created such havoc. So finally he says, "Well, he pins the DSC." So I said, "Okay, DSC. that closes out the so-called Medal of Honor he was going to send me. Not that I was interested in medals. I didn't know what the medals even, what they stood for, you know, even though I was decorated 4 or 5 times prior to this, you know. So I said, I want to finish the war with the troops. You can't finish the war with the troops. You can't fight in the Third Army Zone. I said, what do you mean? I said, it's forbidden at Geneva Conference. It's forbidden for a POW to fight in the same area that he was caught. So I said, U.S. Patton, finally, after back and forth talking, I said, General, you're at George S. Patton, aren't you? I said, yeah. I want to finish the war with the troops. He calls the hospital commandant in. Lose Baum's papers. I'm going to send somebody to pick them up.
Abe Baum was one of the toughest men I'd ever had the honor of knowing. He was a superb combat officer, highly decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts. Abe was always positive about Patton, despite having been shanghaied by the general at Hammelburg. Earlier, I mentioned how the 4th Armored Division was a spearhead unit that relieved the 101st at Bastogne on Christmas Day 1944. Well, Abe Baum was the commanding officer in the lead tank, the very first tank that entered Bastogne on that frozen Christmas morning. And like I said, he was a hell of a man and a hell of a soldier. So with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Tune in next week when we discuss the 1949 film Sands of Iwo Jima, starring the Duke, John Wayne. If you'd like to listen to the oral histories we featured here today, please visit our digital collections at www.online.org. That's www.2online.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.